The experience machine. The experience machine is a famous philosophical thought experiment proposed by American philosopher Robert Nozick in his 1974 book Anarchy, State, and Utopia. The purpose of the thought experiment is to challenge hedonism, the ethical theory that holds that pleasure is the highest or sole intrinsic good, and that a good life is one filled with as much pleasurable experience as possible. Nozick asks us to imagine a hypothetical machine, the experience machine, that can simulate any pleasurable or desirable experience we choose. Once connected, a person would not know they were in a machine, the experiences would feel real, and the person could live out their ideal life, climbing Mount Everest, winning a Nobel Prize, falling in love, creating art, or anything else they desired. The machine would take care of the technicalities, the person would simply experience endless joy, achievement, and fulfillment. The key question Nozick poses is, would you plug in? At first glance, the experience machine seems like a perfect life. But Nozick argues that most people would refuse to plug in, and that this refusal reveals something important about what we truly value. His conclusion is that pleasure alone is not enough for a meaningful life. Nozick offers several reasons why we might reject the machine. We want to do things, not just experience them. There is a difference between actually writing a novel or climbing a mountain and merely feeling as though we did. We want to be a certain kind of person, with a genuine character shaped by real choices, effort, and struggle. Life in the machine, no matter how pleasant, makes us passive recipients of experience. We want contact with reality, to be connected to a world beyond our own mental states. Living in a machine, even a perfect one, is a kind of illusion or deception. These points challenge the core of hedonism. If pleasure were the only thing that mattered, then plugging into the machine would be the most rational choice. But the fact that many people would decline it suggests that we care about more than just feeling good, we care about truth, authenticity, agency, and engagement with the real world. The experience machine continues to be a powerful and provocative tool in ethics and philosophy of mind. It raises deep questions about the nature of happiness, the value of reality, and what it means to live a good life. It also has modern echoes in debates about virtual reality, digital escapism, and artificial intelligence, challenging us to consider how much we are willing to trade real life for pleasurable illusion. Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno's paradoxes are a series of philosophical problems devised by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea in the 5th century BCE. These paradoxes were designed to challenge and probe the concepts of motion, time, and plurality, and they have continued to perplex thinkers for centuries. Zeno's intention was to support the ideas of his mentor, Parmenides, who argued that change and motion are illusions, and that reality is ultimately one, continuous, and unchanging. Through his paradoxes, Zeno sought to show that the common-sense belief in movement and plurality leads to logical contradictions. Perhaps the most famous of Zeno's paradoxes is the Achilles and the tortoise scenario. In it, Achilles, the swift Greek hero, gives a tortoise a head start in a foot race. Zeno argues that Achilles can never overtake the tortoise because, by the time he reaches the point where the tortoise started, the tortoise has moved a bit further ahead. Then, as Achilles reaches that next point, the tortoise again has moved slightly further. This sequence can be repeated infinitely, suggesting that Achilles will always be chasing the tortoise and never actually pass it. The paradox illustrates how motion appears impossible when it is broken down into an infinite number of steps, each of which must be completed before the next begins. Another paradox, known as the dichotomy paradox, follows a similar logic. It states that before reaching any destination, a person must first reach the halfway point. But before reaching the halfway point, one must reach a quarter of the way, and before that an eighth, and so on, creating an infinite regress of tasks. If one must complete an infinite number of steps to get anywhere, then motion should be impossible. Yet, in everyday life, motion is not only possible but constant and observable, creating a stark conflict between logic and experience. A third well-known example is the arrow paradox. In this thought experiment, Zeno claims that for an arrow to be in motion, it must change position. But at any single instant of time, the arrow is motionless, occupying a space equal to its own length. If time is made up of a series of such instants, and the arrow is at rest in each of them, then it must always be at rest, and thus, never move at all. Again, Zeno uses logical reasoning to question the coherence of motion and time as they are commonly understood. Zeno's paradoxes struck at the heart of ancient metaphysics and continue to raise deep questions in modern mathematics and physics. They anticipate complex ideas about infinity, continuity, and the nature of time. It wasn't until the development of calculus and a more rigorous mathematical understanding of infinite series that these paradoxes began to be resolved in a formal sense. Mathematicians showed that an infinite number of decreasing distances or durations can indeed sum to a finite value, allowing motion to be explained without contradiction. Nevertheless, Zeno's paradoxes remain more than historical curiosities. They push us to question the assumptions underlying our perception of reality and highlight the tension between how we experience the world and how we attempt to describe it through logic and mathematics. Their enduring power lies in how they expose the limits of intuition and the subtle complexities hidden in seemingly simple concepts like space, time, and motion. The Infinite Monkey Theorem. The Infinite Monkey Theorem is a thought experiment in probability theory and philosophy that illustrates the concept of randomness and the vast scale of infinity. It imagines a hypothetical scenario in which a monkey, randomly pressing keys on a typewriter for an infinite amount of time, will almost surely produce any given text, such as the complete works of William Shakespeare. While absurd at first glance, the theorem is not meant to be taken literally, but rather as a metaphor to explore ideas about chance, time, and mathematical inevitability. At its core, the Infinite Monkey Theorem demonstrates how randomness, given infinite time or iterations, can lead to the appearance of structure and order. The scenario plays with the laws of probability. If the number of possibilities is finite, as it is with a keyboard, then, over an infinite timeline, even the most complex and coherent sequences will eventually emerge purely by chance. The likelihood of a monkey typing just the phrase, to be, or not to be, is astronomically small, but in the context of infinity, even astronomical improbability becomes inevitability. This theorem is often used to highlight the difference between what is theoretically possible and what is practically feasible. While the probability of a monkey producing a single Shakespearean sonnet is so small as to be virtually zero in any realistic timeframe, the introduction of infinity changes the calculation entirely. It underscores the strange and often counterintuitive nature of infinite sets and probabilistic reasoning. Philosophically, the theorem raises intriguing questions about the role of randomness in the universe and the nature of creativity, order, and meaning. If a coherent and beautiful work like Hamlet can arise from mere chance over enough time, what does that suggest about the origins of complexity in nature or even the development of language and intelligence? Some thinkers invoke the infinite monkey theorem when discussing the spontaneous emergence of order in chaotic systems, or as an analogy for evolutionary processes and the generation of information in a purely naturalistic world. However, the theorem is also a cautionary tale. It reminds us that possibility does not imply probability in a meaningful sense. Just because something could happen does not mean it will, or even that it's worth expecting. The monkey, in this analogy, is not intelligent or intentional, it acts without understanding. The theorem therefore also serves as a contrast to the purposeful creativity of human authorship, highlighting the distinction between randomness and meaning, between mechanical process and conscious design. In the end, the infinite monkey theorem is less about monkeys or typewriters and more about the interplay between chance and certainty when infinity enters the equation. It is a philosophical lens through which we can examine the boundaries of probability, the nature of time, and the curious ways in which order can, at least theoretically, emerge from pure chaos. Sisyphus and the Absurd Hero. Sisyphus and the Absurd Hero is a philosophical concept most famously explored by Albert Camus in his 1942 essay The Myth of Sisyphus. In it, Camus reinterprets the ancient Greek myth of Sisyphus, a king condemned by the gods to roll a heavy boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down every time he reaches the top. This endless, futile labor becomes for Camus a powerful symbol of the human condition and the philosophical concept of the absurd. The absurd, in Camus' philosophy, arises from the tension between two things: the human need for meaning, order, and clarity, and the silent, indifferent universe that offers none. We are creatures who search for purpose in a world that gives us no clear answers. When we recognize this mismatch, we experience the absurd, not as a theory, but as a deep, existential confrontation with the reality of life, death, suffering, and meaninglessness. In this context, Sisyphus becomes more than a mythic figure, he becomes the absurd hero. His punishment is absurd, an eternal, meaningless task, and yet, for Camus, the tragedy of Sisyphus is not his suffering, but the moment of awareness. The key, Camus writes, is that Sisyphus is conscious of his fate. He knows the futility of his task. And yet, if he embraces it without illusion, without hope of escape, he transcends it. His defiance becomes a form of freedom. Camus famously concludes, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." This paradoxical statement captures the essence of the absurd hero, someone who confronts the futility of existence head-on and still chooses to live, to persist, to affirm life. Sisyphus's joy does not come from the success of his task, but from his revolt against despair, his refusal to be defeated by the absurdity of his condition. This vision challenges traditional ideas of meaning, hope, and salvation. Camus does not offer religious faith, rational explanation, or utopian escape. Instead, he offers a form of noble rebellion, to live with lucidity, integrity, and passion, despite the absurd. The absurd hero finds value not in outcomes, but in the dignity of struggle itself. Thus, Sisyphus becomes a mirror for every human being who works, loves, suffers, and strives in the face of uncertainty and death. His ceaseless effort becomes a symbol of what it means to live authentically in a world without guarantees, not in denial of the absurd, but in affirmation of life in spite of it. Logical Positivism. Logical positivism, also known as logical empiricism, is a philosophical movement that emerged in the early 20th century, primarily developed by members of the Vienna Circle, a group of philosophers and scientists including Moritz Schlick, Rudolf Carnap, and Otto Neurath. Its goal was to bring the rigor of scientific thinking to philosophy, and to strip away what its proponents saw as meaningless metaphysical speculation. At the heart of logical positivism is the idea that meaningful statements must be either empirically verifiable or analytically true. In other words, a proposition must be a priori and tautological, like mathematics or logic, where its truth is determined purely by definitions and logical relations, or empirically testable, meaning it can be confirmed or disconfirmed by observation and experience. This criterion of meaning became known as the verification principle. According to this principle, many traditional philosophical claims about God, the soul, free will, or the nature of reality beyond observation, are not just unproven, but literally meaningless, because they cannot be verified through empirical means or logical deduction. For example, a statement like, God exists outside of space and time, cannot be tested or observed, nor is it a tautology, and therefore fails the verification test. Logical positivists sought to unify philosophy and science, seeing philosophy not as a source of deep metaphysical insight, but as a clarifying tool, a way to analyze language and refine scientific reasoning. They believed that philosophy should be primarily concerned with the logical analysis of scientific statements, the structure of theories, and the use of language. This approach had a profound influence on the development of analytic philosophy, philosophy of science, and linguistic analysis. It helped set the stage for later philosophical movements that focused on clarity, precision, and the relationship between language and reality. However, logical positivism eventually fell out of favor, especially by the mid-20th century, for several reasons. The verification principle itself couldn't be verified by its own standards, a self-undermining flaw. The movement struggled to account for theoretical terms in science, like quarks or fields, which are not directly observable but still meaningful and essential to scientific practice. Critics like Karl Popper argued that falsifiability, not verification, was the proper test of scientific meaningfulness. Later philosophers such as W. V. O. Quine and Thomas Kuhn challenged the sharp distinction between analytic and synthetic truths, and questioned the idea that science progresses in a purely rational or linear way. Despite its decline as a dominant school, logical positivism left a lasting legacy. It helped establish a scientific attitude in philosophy, sharpened the tools of logical and linguistic analysis, and raised enduring questions about the nature of meaning, knowledge, and empirical truth. Even as its original doctrines were revised or abandoned, the spirit of clarity and rigor it championed remains a cornerstone of much of contemporary philosophical thought. The principle of charity. The principle of charity is a foundational idea in philosophy and critical thinking that urges us to interpret others' arguments in the strongest, most reasonable form possible before evaluating or criticizing them. Rather than attacking a weak or distorted version of an opponent's view, a logical fallacy known as a straw man, the principle of charity requires us to assume rationality, coherence, and truth-seeking intentions in others, even when we disagree. At its core, the principle of charity is not about being nice or agreeable, but about fostering intellectual honesty and constructive dialogue. When we engage with someone's argument, we often have multiple ways of interpreting their words. The charitable approach chooses the most plausible, logically valid, and evidence-supportable version, especially one that the person themselves would likely endorse if asked to clarify. This doesn't mean ignoring flaws, but rather giving the benefit of the doubt where ambiguity exists. This principle plays a crucial role in philosophical analysis, where ideas are often complex, abstract, or subtly stated. Without it, meaningful debate would be impossible, as discussions would devolve into misrepresentations, accusations, and unproductive disagreement. Applying charity ensures that criticisms are fair and relevant, addressing the actual substance of a claim rather than a distorted caricature. Philosophers like Donald Davidson and Willard Van Orman Quine emphasized the principle of charity in interpreting not only arguments but also language and behavior, especially across cultures or belief systems. Davidson, for instance, argued that to even understand someone's language or beliefs, we must assume that much of what they say is true or rational, otherwise, communication breaks down. In a broader ethical sense, the principle of charity encourages empathy, humility, and open-mindedness. It invites us to suspend premature judgment and to recognize the complexity of human thought. When practiced sincerely, it shifts the goal of argument from winning to understanding, from confrontation to inquiry. In an age of polarized discourse and rapid assumptions, the principle of charity is more than a tool of logic, it is a virtue of intellectual integrity. It reminds us that real engagement with ideas requires not only sharp reasoning but also a deep respect for the minds of others. The paradox of the heap. The paradox of the heap, also known as the Sorites paradox, is a philosophical puzzle that exposes the vagueness of language and the difficulties of making precise distinctions in everyday concepts. It arises when we try to apply clear logic to terms that are inherently fuzzy or imprecise. The paradox is usually presented like this. Imagine a heap of sand. If you remove one grain of sand, it's still a heap. If you remove another grain, it still seems to be a heap. But if you continue removing grains one by one, there must come a point when what remains is no longer a heap. However, it feels absurd to say that removing just a single grain is what causes the shift from heap to non-heap. So when, exactly, does the heap cease to be a heap? This problem reveals a logical gap in how we use vague terms. Words like heap, bald, tall, rich, or old don't have sharp boundaries. They work in everyday conversation, but they resist precise definition. If a man loses one hair, he's still not bald, but how many hairs must be lost before he is bald? If someone earns $1, they are not rich, but how many dollars are enough to clearly say they are? Philosophers have responded to this paradox in different ways. Some argue for supervaluationism, where vague terms have a range of acceptable meanings, and borderline cases are left intentionally undefined. Others turn to fuzzy logic, which allows truth to exist on a spectrum rather than in binary true/false terms. Still others suggest the problem lies in our language, not in reality itself. We try to force clear-cut answers onto things that are inherently gradual and continuous. At its heart, the paradox of the heap challenges the assumption that logic always applies cleanly to real-world concepts. It forces us to question the precision of our words and categories, and to consider how much of our thinking rests on unstable definitions. Dualism. Dualism, most famously associated with the French philosopher René Descartes, is the view that reality consists of two fundamentally different kinds of substances, mind and body. Descartes articulated this position most clearly in his 17th-century work Meditations on First Philosophy, where he sought to establish a firm foundation for knowledge by doubting everything he could until he arrived at something indubitable. That unshakable point was the insight, cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. From this, Descartes inferred that the thinking self, the mind, is distinct from the body, which is extended in space and subject to mechanical laws. In this framework, the mind is characterized by thought, consciousness, and intentionality. It has no physical extension and cannot be divided. The body, by contrast, is material, extended, and divisible, operating in space like a machine. Because of these different natures, Descartes concluded that the two must be distinct substances. This view came to be known as substance dualism, or Cartesian dualism. One of the central challenges to Descartes' dualism, even in his own time, was the mind-body interaction problem. If mind and body are so fundamentally different, one immaterial and the other material, how can they causally interact? For example, how can a mental intention, like deciding to raise one's arm, cause a physical movement in the body? Descartes proposed that the pineal gland, a small organ in the brain, served as the point of interaction between mind and body, though this was largely speculative and not widely accepted even then. Despite such challenges, Cartesian dualism has had a profound and lasting impact on Western thought. It laid the groundwork for the scientific investigation of the body as a machine, separate from the soul or self. At the same time, it raised enduring questions about consciousness, personal identity, and the nature of the self, questions that continue to occupy philosophers, neuroscientists, and psychologists today. While many contemporary thinkers favor physicalist or monist theories, which hold that only the physical exists, Descartes' dualism remains a foundational concept in discussions about the relationship between mind and matter. Moral relativism. Moral relativism is the philosophical view that moral judgments and ethical values are not absolute or universally binding but are instead relative to the cultural, historical, or personal contexts in which they arise. At its core, moral relativism challenges the idea that there exists a single, objective moral truth that applies to all people at all times. Instead, it proposes that what is considered morally right or wrong depends on a specific framework, whether that framework is a particular society's norms, a historical era's standards, or an individual's beliefs and upbringing. This concept often arises in response to the observation of significant moral diversity across cultures. Practices that are deemed virtuous or acceptable in one society might be condemned in another. For example, issues like polygamy, gender roles, or even concepts of justice and punishment vary widely across the world. Moral relativists argue that these differences are not simply mistakes to be corrected by an external standard, but reflections of distinct moral systems that are valid within their own cultural or social domains. There are different forms of moral relativism. Cultural relativism is perhaps the most widely discussed, asserting that moral standards are defined by cultural norms, and that it is inappropriate to judge one culture's morality using the standards of another. Another form, individual relativism, or moral subjectivism, holds that moral judgments are grounded in personal preferences or attitudes, making ethics a matter of individual opinion rather than collective consensus. Critics of moral relativism often argue that it leads to moral paralysis or permissiveness, where no action, however harmful, can be definitively condemned if it aligns with a particular cultural or personal belief. They point out that if all moral perspectives are equally valid, then the ability to critique practices like slavery, genocide, or systemic oppression becomes philosophically undermined. Defenders of moral relativism counter that recognizing moral diversity does not mean abandoning moral reflection, rather, it calls for humility, dialogue, and a deeper understanding of the complex forces that shape ethical systems. Ultimately, moral relativism sits at the crossroads of ethics, anthropology, and philosophy. It invites a re-examination of our assumptions about right and wrong, urging us to consider not only the content of our moral beliefs but also their origins, limitations, and the perspectives of others. Whether seen as a path to tolerance and cross-cultural understanding or a threat to moral accountability, it remains one of the most provocative and debated ideas in moral philosophy. The tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is a philosophical and economic concept that illustrates how individuals, acting in their own rational self-interest, can collectively deplete or destroy a shared, limited resource, even when it is in no one's long-term interest for that to happen. First articulated in a modern context by ecologist Garrett Hardin in a 1968 essay, the concept has since become a foundational idea in environmental ethics, political theory, and the study of collective action. The term originates from the example of a shared pasture, the commons, open to all herders in a community. Each herder gains individually by adding more animals to graze on the land, because the benefit of each additional animal accrues solely to them. However, the cost, the gradual overgrazing and degradation of the land, is shared by everyone. As each herder continues to act according to this logic, the commons becomes exhausted, and eventually no one benefits. What was once a sustainable shared resource becomes ruined by the very freedom that allowed access to it. Hardin's central message was not just about livestock or pastures, but about a broader human dilemma, the tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility. When resources like clean air, oceans, fisheries, forests, or the atmosphere are open for all to use without regulation or stewardship, they are vulnerable to overexploitation. Even though everyone depends on their preservation, no single individual has sufficient incentive to conserve them, leading to mutual harm. The tragedy is not caused by malice, but by a structural flaw in the system, one where rational choices at the individual level lead to irrational outcomes for the group. This paradox has profound implications for environmental policy, global cooperation, population ethics, and economics. It challenges the assumption that markets and individual freedoms alone can ensure the well-being of shared systems. Hardin himself controversially argued that some form of mutual coercion, such as regulations, property rights, or government intervention, is necessary to prevent the tragedy. Others, including thinkers like Elinor Ostrom, have shown that communities can sometimes self-organize and develop local norms and institutions to successfully manage common resources without external authority. At its philosophical core, the tragedy of the commons forces us to confront a key question of moral and political life: how do we balance individual liberty with collective good? And how do we ensure that short-term interests do not blind us to long-term survival? The concept remains a powerful lens for examining the challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, public health, and any situation where what is best for the individual may not be best for all. Deontology. Deontology, especially as formulated by Immanuel Kant, is an ethical theory that emphasizes the importance of duty, rules, and moral principles over consequences. Unlike consequentialist theories such as utilitarianism, which determine the morality of an action based on its outcomes, Kantian deontology holds that some actions are morally obligatory, permissible, or forbidden based solely on their inherent nature or the principles behind them, regardless of the results they produce. At the heart of Kant's moral philosophy is the concept of the categorical imperative, a principle that serves as a universal moral law. Kant proposed several formulations of the categorical imperative, but two of the most influential are: the formula of universal law: act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, before acting, one should ask whether the guiding principle, the maxim, of the action could be adopted by everyone without contradiction. If it leads to a contradiction or an undesirable world, the action is morally impermissible. The formula of humanity: act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. This principle emphasizes respect for human dignity. People should never be used as tools for achieving one's own goals, they must always be treated as valuable in themselves. For Kant, morality is rooted in rationality and autonomy. A moral agent is one who is capable of reasoning and acting according to self-imposed moral laws. This makes morality not about feelings or consequences but about acting from duty, doing the right thing because it is right, not because it produces good results or satisfies desires. An important feature of Kant's deontology is its emphasis on intention. An action has moral worth only if it is done from the motive of duty, not out of self-interest or emotion. For example, telling the truth is the right thing to do, not because it avoids trouble or gains trust, but because truth-telling is a duty we owe to others as rational beings. Kant's theory has had immense influence, offering a clear and structured way of thinking about moral obligations. However, it has also faced criticism, particularly for its rigidity and apparent disregard for consequences. Critics argue that blindly following moral rules can lead to morally troubling outcomes in complex real-world situations. Still, Kantian deontology remains one of the most respected and rigorously defended ethical systems in philosophy, cherished for its clarity, consistency, and deep respect for human dignity. Solipsism. Solipsism is a philosophical idea that begins with radical doubt and arrives at a deeply unsettling conclusion, that only one's own mind can be known to exist with certainty. It is the belief, or at least the possibility, that everything outside of one's own consciousness might be an illusion, a dream, or a projection of the mind. In its most extreme form, solipsism holds that only the self exists, and that the external world, including other people, has no independent reality. The roots of solipsism lie in epistemology, the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge. It questions how we can truly know anything beyond our own experiences. We see, hear, feel, and think, but all of these perceptions are filtered through our consciousness. How can we be sure that what we perceive corresponds to anything real outside ourselves? Perhaps what seems like an external world is merely a vivid dream. Perhaps the people we interact with are figments of our imagination. If all knowledge comes through subjective experience, then how can we ever prove that anything beyond our mind exists? This line of thinking was explored by philosophers like René Descartes, who famously said, "Cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am." Descartes concluded that the act of thinking proves the existence of the self, but he stopped short of embracing solipsism. Others, however, have taken the thought further, recognizing that once we accept that only our own consciousness is directly accessible, everything else becomes philosophically uncertain. Solipsism is often considered more of a theoretical position than a practical belief, because few, if any, people actually live as if nothing else exists. Still, it raises important questions about the limits of human knowledge, the nature of reality, and the challenge of proving the existence of other minds, a problem known as the problem of other minds. While solipsism may seem extreme or isolating, it forces us to confront the foundational mystery of consciousness, that we are trapped within our own minds, interpreting a world we can never step outside ourselves to verify. The Dunning-Kruger Effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias in which people with low ability, knowledge, or experience in a particular area tend to overestimate their own competence. At the same time, those who are highly skilled or knowledgeable are often more modest or uncertain about their abilities, partly because they are more aware of what they do not know. This psychological phenomenon illustrates a disconnect between self-perception and actual performance, and it has broad implications for education, leadership, decision-making, and self-improvement. Named after psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, who first described the effect in 1999, the concept arose from a series of studies showing that people often lack the metacognitive skill to recognize their own incompetence. In other words, when individuals are not good at something, they also tend to be bad at evaluating how bad they are. This leads them to believe they are doing well, even when objective evidence shows otherwise. For example, a person who knows little about grammar may write with confidence, unaware of their errors. Or someone with minimal knowledge of science may speak authoritatively on complex topics, not realizing the depth of their ignorance. The paradox lies in the fact that competence and insight often go hand in hand. People who are genuinely skilled tend to have a better understanding of the domain they're working in, and thus a better sense of the challenges and nuances involved. This awareness can make them more cautious in their self-assessments. In contrast, the less experienced individual not only lacks the necessary skills but also lacks the ability to recognize the gap between their perception and reality. This effect is not merely a curiosity of psychology, it has significant social and philosophical consequences. It helps explain why misinformation spreads, why unqualified individuals may rise to positions of influence, and why constructive criticism is often ignored or misunderstood. It also offers insight into the nature of learning itself. True knowledge often begins with the recognition of one's own ignorance. As Socrates famously noted, wisdom starts with the admission, "I know that I know nothing." Yet the Dunning-Kruger effect should not be read as a condemnation of ignorance, but as a call for humility and self-awareness. It suggests that overconfidence is not always a sign of strength but may be a mask for inexperience. And it reminds us that acquiring real expertise involves not just learning facts or procedures, but developing the ability to assess our own thinking critically. Ultimately, the Dunning-Kruger effect draws attention to the fragile relationship between self-perception and actual knowledge. It reveals the mental blind spots that can hinder growth and cooperation and encourages a deeper commitment to learning, curiosity, and intellectual honesty. The luck-egalitarianism debate. Luck-egalitarianism is a prominent theory in political philosophy that addresses the question of how justice should respond to inequality. At its core, it holds that inequalities in wealth, opportunities, or social standing are morally unjust when they arise from brute luck, factors beyond a person's control, but can be morally acceptable when they result from individual choices and responsibility. This view seeks to blend the values of equality and personal responsibility, offering a middle path between strict egalitarianism, which might aim to eliminate all inequalities, and libertarianism, which emphasizes individual freedom regardless of outcomes. Luck egalitarians believe that a just society should neutralize the effects of unchosen disadvantage, such as being born into poverty, having a disability, or suffering misfortunes like natural disasters, while respecting the outcomes of autonomous decisions. The foundation of luck egalitarianism rests on the distinction between option luck and brute luck. Brute luck refers to circumstances that are not under a person's control, for example, their family background, genetic endowments, or accidents. Option luck involves risks and outcomes that stem from deliberate choices, like gambling, taking a high-risk job, or declining to pursue education. In theory, a luck egalitarian society would compensate individuals for brute luck disadvantages but not for the outcomes of their informed, voluntary choices. For example, someone who is unable to work due to a congenital illness would be supported, while someone who chooses not to work despite having opportunities may not be. The theory has been defended by philosophers such as Ronald Dworkin, G. Cohen, and Richard Arneson, who argue that justice requires people to be equally free to shape their lives, and that this requires removing the influence of morally arbitrary factors like birth or chance. However, luck egalitarianism has also faced significant criticism, particularly from philosophers like Elizabeth Anderson. In her influential critique, she argues that luck egalitarianism can lead to humiliating or demeaning consequences, such as forcing the state to make judgments about whether someone's disadvantage is truly due to bad luck or bad choices. Anderson also contends that focusing too heavily on individual responsibility overlooks the social nature of equality, which should be about creating equal respect and standing among citizens, not just correcting for luck. Another concern is how to measure or distinguish luck from choice, given how deeply intertwined they often are. Even what looks like a personal decision might be shaped by underlying social pressures or early life conditions. Despite these debates, luck egalitarianism remains a powerful and widely discussed idea in contemporary political philosophy. It continues to inform discussions about distributive justice, healthcare, education policy, and welfare systems, especially in thinking about how to design institutions that are fair, yet respectful of individual agency. The central moral impulse of luck egalitarianism, that people should not be disadvantaged for things they could not help, resonates deeply, even as its practical implications remain contested. The mirror test. The mirror test is a psychological experiment designed to assess self-awareness, the ability to recognize oneself as an individual distinct from others. Developed by psychologist Gordon Gallup Jr. in the 1970s, the test offers a simple but profound question: does an animal, or human, recognize its own reflection in a mirror as self, or does it mistake it for another creature? The standard version of the test involves placing a visible mark, such as a dot of paint or a sticker, on a subject's face or body in a place they can't see without a mirror. Then, the subject is given access to a mirror. If the subject uses the mirror to investigate or attempt to remove the mark on their own body, it is taken as evidence that they understand the reflection is their own. This reaction is interpreted as a sign of self-recognition and, by extension, self-awareness. Humans typically begin to pass the mirror test between 18 and 24 months of age. Some non-human animals also pass the test, including great apes, like chimpanzees and orangutans, dolphins, elephants, and certain magpies, suggesting that self-awareness is not uniquely human but also present in some other intelligent species. However, the mirror test is not without controversy. Critics argue that it may not fairly assess self-awareness in animals that rely on senses other than vision, such as smell or sound, or those that simply do not find visual reflection meaningful. Some animals might be self-aware in other ways that the test doesn't detect. Despite its limitations, the mirror test has become a symbolic and practical tool for exploring one of philosophy and psychology's most profound questions: what does it mean to be aware of oneself? The ability to recognize the self is often linked to complex mental traits, like empathy, planning, or moral reasoning, making the test a doorway into deeper discussions about consciousness, intelligence, and what it means to be a sentient being. Existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophical movement that explores the nature of human existence, emphasizing individual freedom, choice, and responsibility in an indifferent or even absurd universe. Rather than providing a single, unified doctrine, existentialism is better understood as a diverse set of ideas expressed by thinkers such as Søren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, and others. What binds them is a shared concern with what it means to exist as a human being, especially in a world that offers no preordained meaning or purpose. At its core, existentialism begins with the insight that existence precedes essence, a phrase popularized by Sartre. This means that human beings are not born with a fixed nature or purpose. Instead, we come into existence first, and only later define ourselves through our actions, choices, and commitments. This places the full weight of creating meaning on the individual. We are radically free, but this freedom also brings a burden, the responsibility to choose authentically and to confront the anxiety and dread that arise from realizing that there is no external source, no God, no universal moral law, no predetermined fate, to guide us. Existentialist thinkers often address the absurdity of life, the tension between the human longing for meaning and the silence of the universe. Camus, in particular, famously illustrated this in the myth of Sisyphus, arguing that life is inherently absurd, yet humans must still find a way to live with dignity and passion, even in the face of that absurdity. Kierkegaard, although religious, explored the anguish of faith and the necessity of a leap beyond rationality to find meaning. Nietzsche, in turn, declared that God is dead, challenging individuals to create their own values in a world stripped of divine order. Existentialism also pays deep attention to authenticity, the idea that we must live in accordance with our true selves, not simply conform to societal roles, expectations, or ideological systems. This often means resisting the bad faith that Sartre described, in which individuals deny their own freedom by hiding behind excuses or adopting false identities. While existentialism can seem bleak, it is also profoundly empowering. It insists that each person has the capacity, and the duty, to define themselves, to act ethically based on personal conviction, and to confront life's challenges with courage and honesty. Rather than giving up in the face of meaninglessness, existentialism urges us to live deliberately, to embrace the full depth of human experience, including suffering, uncertainty, and mortality, and to create value through how we live. Negative utilitarianism. Negative utilitarianism is a variant of classical utilitarianism, a moral theory that judges actions by their consequences, specifically, by how much happiness or suffering they produce. While standard utilitarianism seeks to maximize happiness, negative utilitarianism flips the emphasis. It holds that the primary moral obligation is to minimize suffering. At its core, negative utilitarianism argues that suffering is morally more urgent than pleasure is valuable. While both pain and pleasure matter, the idea is that pain is more intense, more ethically pressing, and more difficult to justify. According to this view, it's better to relieve one person's unbearable suffering than to provide many people with mild pleasure. This leads to some radical implications. If taken to an extreme, negative utilitarianism might suggest that the best possible world is one without sentient life at all, because no life means no suffering. Such conclusions make the theory controversial and raise difficult questions about balance, limits, and the role of positive experiences. The philosopher Karl Popper offered a modest version of negative utilitarianism, stating that we should work to eliminate concrete evils, such as hunger, violence, and oppression, rather than chase after some ideal of perfect happiness, which is vague and subjective. In his view, focusing on the reduction of suffering is more actionable and ethically urgent than the creation of bliss. Negative utilitarianism also plays a significant role in ethics surrounding animal welfare, global poverty, and existential risk. Many who adopt this perspective focus on reducing large-scale suffering, whether it's in factory farming, humanitarian disasters, or future scenarios where intelligent beings could suffer in massive numbers. In essence, negative utilitarianism asks, what if the worst experiences in life matter more, morally, than the best ones? And if that's true, what kind of world should we be trying to build? Ontological pluralism. Ontological pluralism is a philosophical position that holds there are multiple ways of being or existing, and that these different modes of existence are not reducible to a single, universal kind of being. Rather than assuming that all entities share the same fundamental nature of existence, ontological pluralism asserts that different kinds of things exist in different ways, and that recognizing this diversity is essential for a clear and accurate understanding of reality. The roots of ontological pluralism can be traced back to thinkers like Aristotle, who distinguished between different categories of being, such as substance, quantity, quality, and relation, each with its own ontological structure. However, in the modern philosophical landscape, the idea gained renewed interest through the work of philosophers such as William James, Rudolf Carnap, and more recently, Graham Priest and Jason Turner. At its core, ontological pluralism challenges the idea of ontological monism, which holds that to be means the same thing for everything, whether we're talking about a number, a chair, a law of physics, or a moral value. Ontological pluralists argue that such a unified notion of existence flattens the richness of the world. For example, the way a physical object like a rock exists is very different from the way a fictional character, a mathematical entity, or a moral obligation exists. While they may all exist, in some sense, the modes and conditions of their existence differ dramatically. In this view, the word exists functions more like an umbrella term that covers multiple distinct existential frameworks. Just as there are different genres of art or different kinds of explanation in science, there are different ontological domains, each with its own internal logic and structure. Ontological pluralism also plays a significant role in metaphysics, philosophy of language, and logic, particularly in debates about quantification, how we talk about everything, when everything might not be a uniform category. It invites us to ask, when we say that something exists, what are we really claiming? What standards apply to that claim? Does the existence of abstract objects like numbers or fictional characters carry the same weight or meaning as the existence of physical things? Some critics of ontological pluralism argue that it introduces unnecessary complexity or ambiguity, while others see it as a necessary refinement of our understanding of the world, one that respects the rich diversity of phenomena we encounter and the different conceptual tools required to understand them. Ultimately, ontological pluralism is a way of broadening metaphysical sensitivity, allowing philosophy to accommodate the varied and layered nature of what is, and how it is. It asks us not just what exists, but how things exist, and whether those differences truly matter. For the pluralist, the answer is yes, being is not one, but many. Qualia. Qualia, singular, quali, are the subjective, first-person experiences of conscious perception, the raw, what it is like, to see, feel, hear, or taste something. When you look at a red apple and experience its redness, or when you hear the softness of a cello's tone, or feel the sting of pain or the warmth of sunlight on your skin, you are encountering qualia. These are not merely physical events or behavioral responses, but the internal, phenomenal qualities of experiences, the felt texture of consciousness. Philosophers have long been intrigued by qualia because they seem to resist reduction to physical or functional explanations. While neuroscience can describe how light hits the retina, triggers neurons, and results in visual processing, it cannot fully explain why or how those physical processes are accompanied by the experience of seeing red rather than, say, tasting salt. This creates what philosopher David Chalmers famously called the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of explaining why and how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience at all. Qualia are central to many arguments in the philosophy of mind, especially those challenging physicalism, the idea that everything about the mind can be explained in physical terms. For example, Thomas Nagel's famous essay What Is It Like to Be a Bat? argues that no amount of objective, scientific information can fully capture the bat's subjective experience of echolocation. Similarly, Frank Jackson's knowledge argument introduces Mary, a brilliant scientist who knows everything about color vision from a scientific standpoint but has never actually seen color herself. When she finally sees red for the first time, she learns something new: what red looks like. This, Jackson argues, shows that there are truths about consciousness, namely, qualia, that cannot be captured by physical knowledge alone. Critics of qualia argue that they may be ill-defined, non-explanatory, or even illusory. Some philosophers and scientists, particularly those aligned with functionalism or eliminative materialism, believe that once we fully understand the brain and its information processing systems, the mystery of qualia will dissolve. Others argue that qualia are deeply embedded in how we think about experience, and cannot simply be explained away. Regardless of one's stance, the concept of qualia highlights a fundamental divide in philosophy: whether consciousness is a feature that can be explained by science, or whether it represents a profound mystery that challenges our understanding of mind, matter, and reality itself. In this way, qualia serve as a touchstone for deeper questions about perception, identity, knowledge, and the very fabric of subjective existence. Quietism. Quietism is a philosophical and spiritual attitude that emphasizes inner stillness, non-intervention, and the suspension of intellectual or doctrinal striving. In philosophy, particularly in its modern usage, Quietism refers to a skeptical or minimalist stance toward theoretical debate and metaphysical speculation. It suggests that many traditional philosophical problems are not genuine problems at all, but rather the result of confusion about language or misguided assumptions. Rather than offering new theories or systems, Quietism aims to dissolve philosophical puzzles by clarifying how we speak and think. This philosophical quietism is most closely associated with the later work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who argued that many philosophical issues arise when language is used outside of its ordinary context. For example, asking, "What is the meaning of meaning?" or "What is the essence of consciousness?" might seem profound, but quietists see such questions as misuses of language, questions that can be diffused rather than answered. From this perspective, philosophy's role is not to solve grand problems or explain the world, but to bring peace to the mind by showing that the problems themselves are illusions born of linguistic misunderstanding. Quietism in this sense is not anti-intellectual but anti-theoretical. It resists the construction of abstract systems and resists the idea that philosophy should function like science, producing knowledge or uncovering hidden truths. Instead, it sees the philosophical impulse as something to be calmed rather than indulged. For the quietist, clarity and insight come not from argumentation or metaphysical discovery, but from stepping back and seeing how our thinking has gone astray. Outside of analytic philosophy, the term quietism also has a rich spiritual history. In Christian mysticism, particularly in 17th-century Catholic Europe, quietism referred to a controversial movement that emphasized passivity, inner silence, and the surrender of the will to God. Figures like Miguel de Molinos taught that the highest form of prayer was pure contemplation, free of thought, desire, or effort. This spiritual quietism was criticized by church authorities for appearing to reject the importance of moral effort, sacraments, and ecclesiastical authority, and it was eventually condemned as heretical. Yet in both its spiritual and philosophical forms, quietism shares a common thread: the idea that peace comes not from struggle or intellectual conquest, but from letting go of ego, of theory, of the compulsive need to solve or control. It is a stance of radical humility, a recognition of the limits of language, reason, and self-will. To adopt Quietism is to see that some questions are best answered not by speaking, but by becoming still. In the broader philosophical landscape, Quietism is often seen as a challenge to the very ambition of philosophy itself. Where some traditions seek to build systems or discover ultimate truths, Quietism proposes that the deepest form of insight may come from relinquishing that search altogether. It is a philosophy not of answers, but of release. The absence of evidence fallacy. The absence of evidence fallacy is a logical misstep in reasoning that occurs when someone takes a lack of evidence for a claim as proof that the claim is false, or, conversely, assumes that a lack of disproof confirms a claim as true. This fallacy hinges on mistaking silence or uncertainty for definitive knowledge. Just because there is no evidence for something does not necessarily mean that the thing does not exist. It may simply mean that no evidence has yet been found, or that the tools or methods to detect it are insufficient. At its heart, the fallacy is a failure to appreciate the difference between absence of evidence and evidence of absence. The former refers to a situation in which we currently lack information about a particular phenomenon. The latter refers to a case in which we have actively searched for evidence and found nothing, which may be a more legitimate basis for drawing a conclusion. The danger lies in prematurely treating these two conditions as identical, leading to unwarranted certainty. For example, suppose someone claims that intelligent life exists elsewhere in the universe. If another person responds, "There's no proof, so it must not exist," they are committing the absence of evidence fallacy. The fact that we haven't yet discovered extraterrestrial life doesn't mean it isn't out there, it may just be beyond our current means of detection. Similarly, to claim that a historical figure never existed simply because we have no records of them is also to fall into this fallacy. Lack of documentation may result from lost records, gaps in historical transmission, or cultural erasure, not from the person's non-existence. This fallacy often emerges in debates involving science, religion, history, and politics, especially when the burden of proof becomes contested. It is sometimes used rhetorically to shut down inquiry or to dismiss possibilities that are inconvenient or not yet understood. In more nuanced discussions, the fallacy can be avoided by acknowledging the limitations of current knowledge and resisting the temptation to draw definitive conclusions from inconclusive or missing data. Importantly, the fallacy should not be confused with skepticism or critical thinking. It is entirely reasonable to withhold belief in a claim until sufficient evidence is presented. What becomes fallacious is when the lack of evidence is asserted as conclusive proof against the claim, especially in contexts where evidence might reasonably be unavailable or difficult to obtain. Philosophically, the absence of evidence fallacy reminds us of the importance of intellectual humility. It urges caution in how we interpret uncertainty and challenges the human tendency to seek finality where ambiguity still reigns. In a world where knowledge is always incomplete and evolving, recognizing this fallacy helps us remain open to new discoveries while staying grounded in reasoned analysis. The Anthropocentric Bias. The anthropocentric bias is a philosophical and cognitive tendency to interpret the world through a human-centered lens, placing human beings at the center of value, meaning, and relevance. It manifests in the assumption, often implicit, that humans are the most significant entities in the universe, and that reality, morality, and knowledge should be understood primarily or exclusively from the standpoint of human experience and interest. At its root, this bias reflects a deep-seated inclination to measure all things by human standards. In ethics, it often leads to moral frameworks that prioritize human well-being while discounting or overlooking the interests of non-human animals, ecosystems, or future generations. In metaphysics and science, anthropocentric thinking can skew our understanding of the cosmos by interpreting phenomena solely in terms of how they affect or relate to humanity, even when such perspectives are limited or misleading. Historically, anthropocentrism has been embedded in religious, philosophical, and cultural worldviews. In many traditions, humans are seen as uniquely endowed with rationality, soul, or dominion over nature. The Earth, for much of history, was thought to be the center of the universe, both physically and metaphorically, until scientific advances like the Copernican revolution began to challenge this narrative. Still, even in modern contexts, traces of this bias persist in how we approach environmental policy, technology, and animal rights. Philosophers and ethicists have criticized the anthropocentric bias for encouraging exploitative attitudes toward the natural world. When forests, oceans, and species are valued only insofar as they serve human needs, sustainability becomes fragile, and moral responsibility becomes narrowly defined. This critique has led to the development of more ecocentric or biocentric ethical systems, which emphasize the intrinsic value of all life and the interdependence of ecological systems. Thinkers such as Aldo Leopold, Arne Naess, and Peter Singer have called for a widening of the moral circle to include non-human beings and the environment as subjects of ethical concern, not mere objects of utility. In epistemology and the philosophy of mind, anthropocentrism shapes how we think about intelligence, consciousness, and knowledge itself. When human cognition becomes the yardstick by which all other forms of awareness are judged, it becomes difficult to recognize or appreciate alternative forms of intelligence, whether in animals, machines, or hypothetical extraterrestrial life. This bias can limit our understanding and foster a false sense of superiority or exceptionalism. The anthropocentric bias is not necessarily malicious or deliberate, it often arises simply from the fact that we are human, and thus experience the world from a human point of view. But philosophical reflection urges us to become aware of this partiality and to question its consequences. By recognizing the limits of human-centered thinking, we open the possibility for more inclusive, responsible, and nuanced approaches to ethics, science, and our place within the broader fabric of life. Ultimately, overcoming, or at least critically examining, the anthropocentric bias is not about diminishing human value. Rather, it is about decentering ourselves just enough to see more clearly, to understand that we are part of a larger, interconnected world that does not revolve around us, but within which we bear great responsibility. The hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers in the 1990s to highlight a profound and still unresolved issue in the philosophy of mind: why and how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experiences. Unlike the easy problems of consciousness, which involve understanding how the brain perceives stimuli, processes information, or controls behavior, the hard problem addresses the mystery of Qualia, the first-person, inner aspect of mental life. It asks, why does consciousness feel like anything at all? When we see the color red, hear a piece of music, or taste bitterness, there is an undeniable qualitative component to these experiences. These felt qualities are not just about processing sensory data but involve an inner life, a private awareness. According to Chalmers, explaining how neurons fire or how visual information is sorted in the brain doesn't suffice to explain why it is accompanied by conscious experience. One can imagine, in principle, a machine that performs all the same functions as a human brain, processing sights, sounds, and responding appropriately, without experiencing anything from the inside. This leads to the central tension: how does subjective awareness arise from objective matter? The difficulty of the hard problem lies in the apparent gap between the physical and the experiential. Neuroscience can tell us what happens in the brain when someone feels pain or sees blue, but it cannot explain why those processes should produce feeling at all. This has led some philosophers to propose that consciousness cannot be fully explained by physical mechanisms alone. Chalmers himself has entertained the possibility of consciousness being a fundamental property of the universe, like space, time, or mass, a view known as panpsychism. Others, like dualists, argue that consciousness must be non-physical in nature, distinct from the body and brain. Meanwhile, physicalists and materialists argue that the hard problem may seem difficult only because of current cognitive limitations. They maintain that, given enough scientific progress, consciousness will eventually be explained through neurobiological processes, even if it currently seems mysterious. They may reject the framing of the hard problem altogether, suggesting that it is based on misleading intuitions or conceptual confusion. The implications of the hard problem stretch beyond academic philosophy. It has ramifications for fields as diverse as artificial intelligence, ethics, psychology, and even theology. If we do not understand what consciousness is, how can we determine if a machine or animal truly experiences the world? How can we address moral concerns around suffering or personhood? The hard problem forces us to confront the limits of empirical science and the possibility that some aspects of reality may forever elude objective explanation. In essence, the hard problem of consciousness underscores the enigmatic core of human experience, that there is something it is like to be a conscious being. While science has made tremendous progress in mapping the brain and decoding its functions, the leap from electrochemical activity to the richness of inner life remains one of the greatest mysteries of both philosophy and science. The problem of induction. The problem of induction is a fundamental issue in epistemology and the philosophy of science, first clearly articulated by the Scottish philosopher David Hume in the 18th century. It centers on the question of how, or whether, we can justify inductive reasoning, the process by which we infer general principles from particular observations. When we observe a pattern repeatedly, we naturally conclude that the pattern will continue into the future. For instance, having seen the sun rise every morning, we assume it will rise again tomorrow. But Hume asked, on what rational basis do we make this assumption? The challenge arises because inductive reasoning presupposes that the future will resemble the past, that nature is uniform and consistent. Yet, this assumption itself cannot be proven by logic or experience. To justify induction by pointing to its past success is to argue inductively, which creates a circular argument. It assumes the very principle it seeks to prove. In other words, using past experience to validate induction already relies on induction, thus failing to provide a non-circular, rational foundation. Hume did not deny that we use induction constantly or that it is practically indispensable. Rather, his point was that there is no logical necessity compelling the world to continue behaving as it has before. Just because the sun has risen every day in our memory does not guarantee that it must rise tomorrow. The laws of nature, as we understand them, are based on observed regularities, not logical certainties. They could, in theory, change or cease without contradiction. This makes our reliance on induction more a matter of habit or psychological expectation than a fully justified rational principle. The implications of the problem of induction are far-reaching, especially in the realm of science, which relies heavily on empirical observation and generalization. Scientific theories are built on repeated experiments and predictive regularities, but the philosophical foundation for trusting these generalizations remains unsettled. This tension has led philosophers to seek alternative frameworks for understanding scientific reasoning. For example, Karl Popper responded to the problem by suggesting that science should not try to prove theories through induction, but instead should aim to falsify them. According to this view, a scientific claim is meaningful only if it can, in principle, be proven wrong by experience. Despite centuries of discussion, the problem of induction remains unresolved in a definitive way. It serves as a humbling reminder of the limits of human knowledge and the fragility of the foundations on which our understanding of the world rests. Yet it also highlights a deeper truth about the nature of rationality, that much of what we consider knowledge is built not on certainty, but on trust, pattern recognition, and practical success. Inductive reasoning, while philosophically vulnerable, remains one of the most powerful tools we have for navigating an uncertain and ever-changing world. Akrasia. Akrasia is a concept in philosophy that refers to a state in which a person acts against their better judgment. It is the puzzling phenomenon of knowing the right or best course of action and yet doing otherwise. Someone who experiences akrasia might, for instance, believe they should exercise regularly, fully understand the benefits of doing so, even plan to go to the gym, only to skip it in favor of watching television. The term comes from ancient Greek, meaning lack of command or weakness of will, and it has long intrigued philosophers because it seems to challenge the assumption that humans act according to reason. The issue of akrasia was first systematically explored by Socrates, as presented in Plato's dialogues, particularly the Protagoras. Socrates famously argued that akrasia, properly understood, is impossible. He believed that no one willingly chooses to do wrong or to act contrary to what they perceive as good. If someone acts against their better judgment, it must be because they are mistaken about what is truly best. For Socrates, all wrongdoing is a result of ignorance. If a person truly knew what was best, they would act accordingly. This intellectualist view asserts that knowledge is sufficient for virtuous action. However, this explanation did not fully satisfy later philosophers. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, offered a more nuanced account. He acknowledged that akrasia does occur and distinguished between two types, one arising from impulsive passion and another from a more settled kind of weakness. Aristotle explained that a person can have knowledge in a general sense but fail to apply it in the moment due to emotional or bodily desires overwhelming rational thought. In such cases, the person does not act in full knowledge. They are, in a way, temporarily clouded or distracted from their better judgment. This view allowed room for internal conflict and emphasized the role of habituation and moral character in strengthening the will. Throughout the history of philosophy, akrasia has raised difficult questions about human rationality, self-control, and freedom. It presents a challenge to the idea that human beings are unified agents consistently guided by reason. Instead, it reveals a fractured self, where reason, emotion, and desire may be in tension. Later thinkers, such as the Stoics, tried to eliminate the problem by striving for an ideal of inner harmony, where reason would reign supreme. Others, like Augustine, explored akrasia in terms of sin and spiritual struggle, seeing it as evidence of a divided will and the need for divine grace. In modern philosophy and psychology, akrasia continues to be a rich topic of investigation. It is often examined in light of decision theory, behavioral economics, and theories of self-control. Some contemporary accounts describe it in terms of internal conflict between short-term and long-term preferences, or as a failure in the mechanisms of executive function. For example, one may prioritize immediate pleasure despite holding a long-term goal that contradicts it, not because of ignorance, but due to a failure to regulate impulse or delay gratification. Akrasia is more than a theoretical puzzle, it is a deeply human experience. Nearly everyone can recall moments when they acted in ways they later regretted, fully aware at the time that they were making the wrong choice. It speaks to the complexity of human motivation and the difficulty of living in alignment with one's values. It raises important ethical and psychological questions about responsibility. If someone knows what is right but cannot bring themselves to do it, are they still blameworthy? Or are they in need of help, understanding, or moral education? Ultimately, Akrasia exposes the fragility of will and the constant struggle to live with integrity. It reminds us that knowing the good is not always enough, and that the path to virtue requires more than knowledge. It demands discipline, self-awareness, and often the slow cultivation of habits that align emotion and desire with reason. It is a humbling concept, but also one that invites compassion, for others and for ourselves. Absurdism. Absurdism is a philosophical perspective that emerges from the confrontation between the human desire for meaning and the apparent indifference or silence of the universe. It is the recognition that while people are inherently driven to seek purpose, coherence, and understanding in their lives and the world around them, the universe offers no clear or definitive answers. This fundamental disconnect creates what is known as the absurd. The term does not imply that life is comically ridiculous, but rather that there is a dissonance between our longing for clarity and the unyielding ambiguity of existence. The roots of absurdism can be traced through existentialist thought, particularly in the work of Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche, who both wrestled with questions of meaning in the face of a seemingly godless and chaotic world. However, it was the 20th-century French-Algerian writer and philosopher Albert Camus who most directly articulated absurdism as a distinct philosophical stance. In works such as The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus described the absurd condition as a tension born from the collision of two truths, the human craving for significance and the cold, mute indifference of the universe. For Camus, the absurd is not something that resides outside of us, but arises in the relationship between us and the world. It is not the world that is absurd in itself, nor is it humanity's desire that is inherently flawed, but rather the irreconcilability of the two. This realization can be deeply unsettling, but Camus insists that it need not lead to despair. Instead, it presents a choice. Upon recognizing the absurd, one could choose to escape it, through religion, ideology, or even suicide, but for Camus, these were evasions, forms of philosophical surrender. He argued instead for a third path, to accept the absurd fully and live in conscious rebellion against it. This rebellion is not a call to arms but a stance of defiant joy, a refusal to give in to despair. It involves embracing life in all its complexity and contradiction, without illusion. Camus uses the figure of Sisyphus, condemned to eternally push a boulder up a hill only to watch it roll back down, as a symbol of the absurd hero. Though Sisyphus's task is futile, Camus imagines him happy, because he has come to understand and embrace his condition. His joy lies in the struggle itself, in the pure act of living with eyes wide open. Absurdism does not deny suffering or the darkness of existence, but it also does not let those become excuses for disengagement. Rather than retreating into despair or clinging to false hopes, it advocates for a life lived with honesty, courage, and even a kind of liberated exuberance. Freed from the need for cosmic justification, the individual can find personal meaning in experiences, relationships, and creative acts, not as eternal truths, but as expressions of freedom and self-assertion. In this way, absurdism stands apart from both nihilism and religious existentialism. It does not claim that life has no value, but that it has no inherent value imposed from without. Meaning, then, becomes something to be created, not discovered. The absurd, far from being a reason to despair, becomes an invitation to live more authentically, with a deeper awareness of the limits and possibilities of human existence. In confronting the absurd, we do not conquer it, but we learn to live alongside it, lucidly, defiantly, and even joyfully.